Kristi Noem, the governor of South Dakota and potential Trump running mate for 2024, though not anymore, I guess, has found herself in the middle of what meteorologists would call a massive, epic storm. And it all begins with a revelation offered up freely by Noem herself in her forthcoming book about how she killed her dog. The Guardian had the report, quote, "Cricket was a wire hair pointer about 14 months old," the South Dakota governor writes in a new book, adding that the dog, a female, had an aggressive personality and needed to be trained to be used for hunting pheasant. By taking Cricket on a pheasant hunt with older dogs, Noem says she hoped to calm the young dog down and begin to teach her how to behave. Unfortunately, Cricket ruined the hunt, going out of her mind with excitement, chasing all those birds and having the time of her life. Noem describes Cricket then using an electronic collar to attempt to bring her under control. Nothing worked. And then on the way home after the hunt, as Noem stopped to talk to a local family, Cricket escaped Noem's truck and attacked the family's chickens, grabbing one chicken at a time, crunching it to death with one bite, then dropping it to attack another. Cricket, the untrainable dog, Noem writes, behaved like a trained assassin. When Noem finally grabbed Cricket, she says the dog whipped around to bite me. Then, as the chicken's owner wept, Noem repeatedly apologized and wrote the shocked family a check for the price they asked and helped them dispose of the carcasses littering the scene of the crime. Through it all, Noem says Cricket was the picture of pure joy. "I hated that dog," Noem writes, adding that Cricket had proved herself untrainable, dangerous to anybody she came in contact with, and less than worthless as a hunting dog. Okay, now, Noem then tells us about how she decided that she had no choice but to put the dog down. So she led the dog down to a gravel pit and she shot it. And this, again, I remind you, is a story that Kristi Noem chose to tell in her own book. Nobody would know about the tragic demise of poor Cricket if not for Noem writing about it in her book. Why did she tell this story? Well, in subsequent public statements, she has explained that this was meant to be a story about how she's a tough woman who isn't afraid to make difficult decisions. Here's what she tweeted on Saturday, or rather on Sunday. Quote, "I can understand why some people are upset about a 20-year-old story of Cricket, one of our working dogs at our ranch, in my forthcoming book, No Going Back. The book is filled with many honest stories of my life, good and bad days, challenges, painful decisions, and lessons learned. What I learned from my years of public service, especially leading South Dakota through COVID, is people are looking for leaders who are authentic, willing to learn from the past, and don't shy away from tough challenges. My hope is anyone reading this book will have an understanding that I always work to make the best decisions I can for the people in my life. The fact is, South Dakota law states that dogs who attack and kill livestock can be put down. Given that Cricket had shown aggressive behavior toward people by biting them, I decided what I did. Whether running the ranch or in politics, I have never passed on my responsibilities to anyone else to handle, even if it's hard and painful. I followed the law and was being a responsible parent, dog owner, and neighbor. As I explained in the book, it wasn't easy, but often the easy way isn't the right way." Okay. Now, this defense, as you might imagine, has not been persuasive to the vast majority of the public. And over the past few days, after this excerpt from the book was made public, Noem has faced immense backlash from all corners of the political world. Left and right have blasted her relentlessly and ruthlessly. Just to give you some idea, the tweet that I just read to you, that with her, defending herself, has, as of last night, it had 22,000 comments underneath it, and basically all of them, including many from prominent conservatives, and of course a great many leftists, are condemning her in no uncertain terms. I scrolled through the first 100 comments just for reference, and not a single one of them, not one, was sympathetic to her. Zero, it's like 100 to 0 against her right now is the verdict. And she's been trending now for days, and she's been discussed on every major news show, and all of the commentary has agreed that not only is she a dog-murdering psychopath, but she's also killed her political career just as surely as she killed poor old Cricket. And we can honestly say, without the slightest hint of exaggeration, that no politician in modern American history has ever been this widely condemned for anything. I mean, ever. Think of an example of any politician ever being this roundly, maybe Anthony Weiner is the other example I could think of. And so Anthony Weiner and Kristi Noem. What do we make of that? Well, for one thing, we can say for certain that Kristi Noem has the political intelligence and political instincts of a cantaloupe. Anybody with a passing familiarity with modern American culture can tell you that the very last thing any politician with national ambition should ever do is admit to killing a dog. You would be better off confessing to anything else. I mean anything, including killing a person. And we'll get back to that in a moment. And she could confess in that book that 20 years ago, she got really mad at her neighbor and walked over and shot her neighbor in the face. And I promise you, there would be less outrage over that than the dog. I promise you. But from a purely political perspective, this is the most egregious unforced error we have ever seen in our lifetimes. And all for the sake of proving that she can make tough decisions. I mean, does she not have any other anecdotes that could make that point? Like, is that really, that's what you go with? It's like if you went to a job interview and the interviewer asked, like, what are your greatest strengths? And you said, well, I'm really good at setting stuff on fire. Now, even if you meant that in a positive way, like even if you only ever set things on fire for good reasons, it's just a bizarre fact to offer into evidence in that context. Like, just choose something else. Don't choose that. It's too much baggage with that, right? Why choose that of all things? And the context in this case is a book that exists purely to lend her, Noem, that is, some legitimacy on the national stage and earn some easy publicity. Every politician writes a book like this if they're running for national office or if they expect that they might be nominated for vice president. Nobody ever actually reads these books. They'll sell 12,000 copies in the first month, and then they're forgotten, and not a single additional copy is sold, and nobody remembers that it was written. You're not supposed to actually make news with these books. You're not supposed to say anything legitimately noteworthy. And by all accounts, Noem's book is dutifully boring and pointless, full of Republican cliches and boilerplate, with this one story about killing a dog and another about killing a goat, apparently, randomly dropped into the middle of it. This is the only interesting thing that has ever been written in a politician's memoir. So, I mean, I guess you could say that much in her defense. Like, at least there have been many books like this, and it's the only time that any politician has ever read anything that made you go, whoa, really? Only time. But now we see why they usually avoid writing interesting things in their memoirs, because it doesn't go well for them. But even if it was politically suicidal for Noem to reveal herself as the anti-John Wick, was she actually wrong for what she did? That's the question. Like, was it actually wrong to pull an old yeller on cricket? Well, I'm not much of an animal rights activist myself. You know that. I don't expect that my PETA membership card will be arriving in the mail anytime soon. But even so, I would say that yes, Noem was wrong to kill her dog in that situation. And look, if you've lost me on the topic like this, you're in trouble. Yeah, if I'm not on your side, that's rough. You're in rough shape. Now, granted, life on a farm is not like life in the suburbs. Animals are kept for utility. They have to pull their weight. And anyone who is not a vegetarian eats food every day that was once a defenseless animal put down, much like cricket was, and then butchered and consumed. Okay, which presumably cricket wasn't, although she doesn't say. And you might be squeamish about it, but that's the way it works. And that's where your food comes from. And you should be an adult about it when it comes to how things go on farms, because again, the world would starve to death if we didn't eat animals. And so in general, we need to understand that about farm life. But that does not let Noem off the hook in this case, because it sounds like cricket was poorly trained. At 14 months old, it doesn't sound like enough time was devoted to properly training her to be a useful animal on the farm. You can't just kill a dog because you're annoyed with it. I mean, if I killed every animal that annoyed me, I would be like the Genghis Khan of Kristi Noems. But I haven't killed any animals, for the record, because taking a life, even an animal life, requires greater moral justification than that. These are God's creatures after all. So Kristi Noem was wrong for killing the dog, even if plenty of other animals were killed on her farm for perfectly justifiable reasons, which they probably were because it's a farm. This one does not seem to be justified, in my opinion. And if I could go back and rescue cricket from her cruel fate, I would. Although if I did, she'd still be dead at this point because this happened like 20 years ago. Still, I am opposed to the killing. I think it was wrong. And so I agree with the thrust of the criticism of Kristi Noem. Yet the reaction is still absurdly overblown. I mean, this amount of outrage over a dog killed on a farm 2 decades ago is a bit excessive, especially when you contrast it with politicians who have publicly confessed to killing people, not just people, but their own children. Consider the fact that several prominent national politicians have in recent years admitted to getting abortions. And one example is Representative Pramila Jayapal, who wrote about her abortion story in the Washington Post in 2019. And according to Jayapal, her first child, who now supposedly identifies as non-binary and who Jayapal refers to as they throughout the article, had a difficult birth and wound up in the NICU for a few months. Eventually, Jayapal divorced the father of her child and met somebody else. And then she conceived another child with the new man, but decided that she was going to kill the child because she didn't want to potentially go through another difficult birth. And you might find some similarities here in the reasoning. Kristi Noem killed her dog because it was difficult. Jayapal killed her child because she thought the child might be difficult. And you probably don't remember this story about Jayapal because there wasn't much outrage in response to it. She didn't trend for days on end. She wasn't condemned by both sides of the political aisle, or even one side, really. There was nothing like the anger and vitriol being directed at Kristi Noem. The public, to include conservatives, have proven to be far, 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 far less accepting of politicians killing dogs than of politicians killing their own human offspring. In fact, Jayapal was celebrated by many of the people now screaming at Kristi Noem. So it's not just that people are less upset by the murder of children than by the murder of dogs. It's that many people are actively in favor of the former. And those not in favor still can't muster the kind of disgust and visceral revulsion in the face of it that they can for a dead dog. This is a sign of a truly sick society, one that will not and cannot survive so long as it prioritizes, dogs over people. There has never been a human society that valued dogs over its own children. We are the first. This is a form of moral dementia that we are pioneering. Now, whenever we have conversations like this, I'll be accused of hating animals. But the truth is, I don't hate animals. How could I? Animals they're not moral creatures, first of all. They aren't capable of committing acts of evil. So they're like, there's nothing to hate. But just as they're not capable of committing evil, so too are they incapable of performing acts of virtue. It is because human beings can be evil that they can also be virtuous. And it is virtuous to treat animals with kindness and love. It is good to love animals. But we are called to love and protect human children even more. This is the kind of thing that shouldn't need explaining. It should come instinctively to every person. And for nearly all people who have ever lived on earth, it has come instinctively. Only in our culture do we systematically murder hundreds of thousands of human children every year while elevating dogs to the status of children. Indeed, many of the very same people who kill their children are also elevating dogs in this way. They are actually, quite literally, replacing their kids with dogs. So, look, if you are pro-life and you fight against the murder of the unborn and you have the appropriate emotional reaction to stories of mothers killing their own children, and you love and protect human children above all, and you also happen to love dogs and you cherish them because they're God's creatures too, then that's great. You have your priorities exactly in order. You should be commended. I have no issue with you whatsoever. You're exactly right when it comes to this. Fantastic. But we all know that you, sadly, are not representative of the majority. The majority of Americans are either in favor of or indifferent to the mass slaughter of human children, and either implicitly or explicitly value dogs and other four-legged creatures above humans, including children, including even, in some cases, their own children. And that, to me, is the real scandal. I feel bad for poor Cricket. I feel worse about the approximately 20 million human children murdered in this country since Cricket's demise. And that's why those who are outraged far more by the death of one dog than the 20 million human deaths since then are today canceled. Hey, YouTube, thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like access to my full show with no ads, you should go to dailywire.com and use promo code Walsh to get 2 months free on all annual plans. See you there.